I've had a very interesting career over the years. When I started out, we were working on shuttle, and that was a government-owned, government-operated system. And through launch, we've transitioned over to where we build the rocket, but we sell a launch service. And we're seeing that same kind of transformation going on across the ecosystem, expanding now with commercial LEO destinations and the commercial lunar payload services. And so part of that is what prompted us to have this conversation today around what is the future of finance with NASA. And so I'd like to thank Greg Autry for joining us here today. He's the nominee for becoming the CFO for NASA, and I hope you will enjoy the conversation. Greg, I know there are some things that we need to steer away from, being a nominee and all, but are there some opening comments that you'd like to make and share to help set the stage here?
Yeah, actually, we're at what I like to say is interesting times. There's a great Chinese proverb about may you live in interesting times, and being the nominee to be the CFO of NASA is a really interesting position to be in at this moment. But what I really want to talk with you about is the future, a few years from now and beyond, and what civil space will look like as a domain when the current issues are settled. I'm not as interested in what Congress wants to do or what the White House wants to do right now. But for that context, actually, I had a couple of slides I wanted to throw up there because I think this is important to understand. Actually, what just happened here?
Go forward.
Okay.
There we go.
This, I think, is the most important slide I can possibly give you. The red line is the growth in Medicare spending since that program was founded. It's important to realize when that program was founded, people over 65 were going to get health care from the government, a great idea that President Johnson put forward and that many of us probably actually use, and I'll be using in a couple of years. But the average lifespan in the United States in that year was 67 years old. Now people are living well into their 80s, and of course the medical treatments we have are so much more amazing and expensive than anybody could have possibly conceived at that time. So here we are, and I don't think that's going to change. I'm not here to argue about whether that's a good expenditure of our public funds or not, but that is the expenditure of our public funds. It's not going to change. The blue line is NASA, right? And NASA's been kind of nominally stuck somewhere between $18 and $25 billion going back to the early 1990s. And obviously there are people that want to make some drastic changes now one way or another, but not big enough to make it a huge difference in the scope of things. In fact, if you look at federal total expenditures, which is that blue line, and you look at NASA, which is the dotted red line, the dotted red line is if you removed NASA, you just closed every center and headquarters and fired everybody and didn't spend a penny, you wouldn't notice the difference, is what it comes down to. When I had the honor of serving on the 2016 agency review team for the first Trump administration, NASA was 0.42% of the federal budget. And despite some nominal increases since then, it's now 0.3 something, and that's just the way it is. We've got to think about that. So I think that gives us some huge context and everything we think about in civil space. I think we need to be aware of that. It's not a partisan issue. It's just where we are. The other thing is just about bespoke systems and the sunk cost fallacy, right? So love the James Webb Space Telescope. Who loves the James Webb Space Telescope? Okay. Amazing science. Amazing photos. The public loves photos. It helps build support, I think, for NASA in so many ways. But that project ran an order of magnitude over budget, right? And I like to say to my rocket science friends like you know, if the engineering calculations had been off by an order of magnitude, would that be a problem, right? Or if the science data was off by an order of magnitude, would that be a problem, right? And we've got to realize finance matters. You cannot be off by an order of magnitude. And to put that in perspective, you know, we went from 800 million to somewhere over 10 billion. Mars sample return, a controversial mission at the moment. Think of the opportunity cost of that. I love that mission. It's something I've always, since I was a kid, thought we had to do. But I asked AI about the $11 billion that it currently might cost to do that program, and it told me that we could send 220,000 American students through college instead of doing that mission. So the opportunity cost is huge. We've got to be stewards of the taxpayers' money. All right, I'm going to pause on this and let's talk a little bit. Then I want to talk about why I care about that slide.
Oh, okay. So I guess one of the things that I'd like to pull on, we've heard in the past better, faster, cheaper. We've had lots of different runs at how do we be more effective. I guess what do you see as how commercial can help with the affordability and trying to meet our aspirations but still being affordable?
Exactly. I think we're at an amazing point where the opportunities are almost as big as the challenges, and that is good. And that's why I have this slide up. Who knows what this slide represents? Shout it out.
Moore's Law.
Moore's Law, there you go. So Gordon Moore at Intel had the brilliant observation that there's almost a linear function over time between the number of transistors that you can put on an integrated circuit and time. And we've gone through from a few dozen transistors in the first integrated circuits up to literally billions of them now, which means we get higher performance and lower cost for performance out of the systems, and that has driven amazing apps. I started my career actually as a software engineer, a video game programmer in high school with 8-bit processors, and now you can do so much more for so much less. The great thing is, if you look at the launch cost per kilogram chart, a lot of you have probably seen this, because of amazing new systems like Vulkan, thank you, and New Glenn coming from Blue Origin, and what SpaceX has done over the last few years, we're seeing a similar situation where the primary driver of the cost for access to this market is going down in cost, and the reliability is going up at the same time, and the cadence, the access is going up. It's a really good place to be, and that has so many positive implications for what we can do at a civil space agency. And I am excited, of course, about the launch side. But beyond that, you've also got a supply chain that is more robust than it's ever been because of all of the new companies that are coming in, and a supply chain that is also weaker and more fragile than it's ever been in a lot of ways because of our access to primary resources and some other components. So we're at an opportunity, though, where I think we care and we're focused on that supply chain for reasons beyond space, and we're going to see that you're going to be able to get the components you need in a manner that is much more efficient and more commoditized than we've ever had in the past.
You know, I think I also see some of the challenges with retaining the health of that supply chain as we're trying to expand rate, as we're trying to get everything more affordable. We're tackling that on the launch side. Do you think there are other elements that we could be doing differently or approaching things differently from either science missions or other government programs in space beyond LEO?
There are, and like I said, the thing that makes me happy, though, is that people understand what a supply chain is in our government, and they actually care about it for the first time in a long time. I wrote a book many years ago called Death by China, which in 2010. If people had listened to me then, I don't think we'd be where we are right now, but you know, I watched us sending our supply chain over to an aggressor state, and people didn't understand at that time they were an aggressor state, but here we are, and that's a tough situation to be in. And so much of what we need comes from China, Russia, or states that are now almost proxies of China, that it's hard from a domestic standpoint to get what we need, particularly for our national security, but in so many other industries. But the good news, John, is that people understand it. And again, it's not a partisan issue. People in Congress, people in the White House are focused on fixing that supply chain. I hope they make the right decisions. If they do, that's good for space. It's good for NASA. It's good for space science and human space flight, because we need a supply chain where you can, frankly, go online and order many of the components you need to put a satellite together. And I think we're going to get to that point, and we're going to get to the point where you're going to see those prices falling for those subcomponents, and you're going to be able to put your instruments on systems that that other companies are going to build for you and deploy to locations at times that you want to be there, and you won't have to build propulsion and power and backbone for your science mission. You'll just attach it to something that's going to the right place at the right time, and that'll be a good place for NASA to be.
I know we've talked in the past about some of the lunar opportunities and some of the implications of resources at the moon. Do you see that tying back to enabling change to our supply chain? Or do we need to be really focused on how do we transition to more of a commercial mindset terrestrially before we worry about lunar?
So I wrote a book on this. Let me plug my book, Red Moon Rising. If anybody cares, I'm going to go over to that table on the far right after this and sign copies if you want to get a copy from me. There are things in here I can't say as a nominee, but I wrote them, so I can't deny them. Yeah, I think it's super important that we realize that we have an object the size of Africa just 3 days away that's full of all sorts of materials that we may not have easy access to, or that may be environmentally damaging to collect and process. And we're going to be able to do that on the moon. I'm going to be perfectly honest, though. I'm not Pollyanna. I think that is decade or decades away from being a practical application, but we need to start thinking that way. Mm-hmm. When we do, we're going to develop technology that have dual use applications here on Earth. For instance, you want to do mineral assaying on the moon. You don't want to collect a sample and take it and then mail it off to some assay office and see what's in it and wait for the results. You've got to do it in situ. And on Earth, that has serious implications too. People are talking about the mineral wealth of Greenland, for instance. Getting to that mineral wealth might have a lot of similarities to getting to the mineral wealth on the moon. Right?
Yeah. So thinking back around cost and the finance side of things, I think we've been focused on commercial becoming owner-operators and expanding, playing a bigger role, creating infrastructure to be able to enable things to be more affordable. I think it's easy to see commercial industry creating infrastructure, but are there other things that commercial either should or shouldn't do that we really need to rely on the government for?
Yeah, the government, I think, when it's smart, and there's some actually really good examples of the U.S. government being smart, as hard as that is to believe for some people. But if you look at what we did in aircraft when we founded NACA back in the 1920s, because World War I showed us that we had fallen behind in an industry that we had created, we were actually really successful in a government private industry partnership with companies at the time like Boeing and Lockheed, who are now amazing industrial giants. They needed the government at that time to step up. They needed the government to be an anchor customer sometimes, whether that was the military or the airmail program. You look at the internet, same thing there. Government invented something that had national security implications and held it tight for a number of years, but eventually realized that the commercial sector could benefit and was careful to have policies like no sales tax on internet sales for many years to give companies like Amazon a chance to step up and succeed. And we wouldn't probably have Blue Origin if that decision hadn't been made back in the 1990s to give a tax waiver to e-commerce companies. Those are smart ideas, and we need to be thinking strategically the same way in space. The government can do things that help the private market succeed, and then it needs to get the hell out of the way when the time is right and let it go. But if you have a purely libertarian mindset, I do believe a commercial space sector would emerge and be really successful all on its own, but probably not in my lifetime. And unfortunately, if you have external geopolitical competitors who are aggressor states who want to grab all of the opportunities and resources and the soft power that comes with that geopolitically, you have to be on a time frame that's compatible with the reality that you're competing in.
Yeah, I found some of this morning's conversation interesting too around the commercial LEO destinations, and there just seems to be some healthy tension still between, is it time to allow commercial to step into LEO and move out quickly, or do we still need the government to be playing a stronger control role at the moment? And I don't want to get into too much politics at the moment, but I think it's worth having the conversation around when is the right time and how do we enable commercial to step in and move NASA and other government agencies further out. Do you think internationally that becomes part of that conversation, or how do we build on NASA's partnerships internationally to try and move the ecosystem beyond just LEO and get more partnership outward?
Yeah, a really great question. I think there's some amazing opportunities in microgravity research at LEO. For instance, for manufacturing, I served for a few years reviewing business case studies for NASA's NSPA program, the In-Space Production Application out at JSC, looking at what could be done there. And a lot of these things are speculative, but very, very interesting and huge potential promises. And we need to make the small investments that it takes for those to succeed as American industries. And again, if we left it alone, it might happen in a few decades on its own. But the fact is we have the Chinese who understand this very well, and they're going to aggressively pursue these opportunities. And we have to decide whether we want to be in a situation where we're helping American companies accelerate so that we have a free market competition to their state-planned system, or if we don't. And I don't think it's enough to have a couple of folks in a capsule in space all the time flying by the big Chinese space station and waving as they go by it. So, you know, how do we get there? I think with our international partners in an era of constraints budget is super important. We need to look at new partners that haven't been engaged before. Maybe that's South Korea, maybe that's the Saudis or the UAE. There are a lot of countries we could bring on board that actually have budgets, right? Not just putting them in there to show, but to contribute significantly to the finances. And that has not always been the case with our international partners writing checks.
You know, it's also interesting, a lot of the focus we have on cost and everything is with the LEO mission in mind. That is where the dominant mass that we're putting up today is going. But as we start to look beyond LEO to go to other orbit regimes or to NEOs or robotically or to the moon, I think that creates an environment where we can have a lot broader engagement with the academic circles. And how do we start to incentivize and help grow interest in not just STEM, but all the other fields that we want to have space people that are coming in from the academic side of the world?
Yeah, so one of the things that I like to point out is if you look at the higher launch cadence, right, a lot of that is US based. This is an opportunity to get our students in there. I am excited to realize that it's not just STEM. I have the amazing title at University of Central Florida of being Space Czar. So I look across our space enterprise at the university. I've had the amazing opportunity just this last week to launch our online Space MBA program. If anybody wants to talk to me about that, we're over at booth 705, and we'd love to talk to you about everything going on at Space U. But it's not just engineering and it's not just science. We need the hospitality school at UCF to be the leader in space tourism, and we're working on that. We need to make sure that we look at industries from soup to nuts. So I think we're doing a good job of telling our students that we want them to go into STEM, but we also need to make sure that we realize that there are jobs in every single industry that space can enable. And as these numbers go forward, Moore's Law matters incredibly. So if you look at app revenue from software, I mentioned the boom that happened after those microprocessors came out. This is what's really going to count, John. It's not just the rocket launches. Bless you for doing the rocket launches, and I hope you and Tori make a lot of money doing them. But the fact of the matter is the stuff we don't know about, nobody had any idea of the things we do now on the internet when they decided to start building those microprocessors. Those unknown applications are going to provide so many jobs in STEM and outside, and our government needs to understand that we're making an investment in that.
You know, I think the investment there is helpful. I also think there's a lot of, I don't want to call it military applications directly as much as things like domain awareness, where we need to understand more about the environment once we get beyond LEO. We've been to the moon, we've been to other parts of Earth orbit or beyond Earth orbit, but we basically have snapshots. I think that's one of the things that I learned from Parker Solar Probe. When it flew, as much as the amazing science that we learned about the sun and magnetic fields was, one of the things that was surprising was they did a flyby of Venus and gained insights into the interactions between Venus and the sun that no one had ever speculated about. And so I think there is also benefit to be gained from space domain awareness, but then also just the pure science that NASA does. Do you see that, or success stories that we have within the NASA community that can help inspire how we move forward to that future?
Yeah, I had to be the honor to be at the Collier Awards ceremony last month in D.C. When Nikki Fox picked up the trophy for the Parker Solar Probe. And it's great to see NASA's picked up that award, the most prestigious award in aviation for, I think, the last 4 years, right? In the case of Parker, that vehicle's going almost 500,000 miles per hour, right? It's the fastest thing that we've ever built. I think that the engineering behind that and the science behind that is incredibly inspirational. And it's a program, along with a few other programs that don't get called out, that was pretty much on schedule and on budget. And we can do that, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's incredibly inspiring. And NASA science, I think, for people all around the world has inspired them to enter STEM careers. I entered a STEM career because I was inspired by space, really by the Apollo program, when I was 6. And at the time that I entered the workforce in the 1980s, it wasn't the most exciting time in space at the moment, and ended up in software along with a lot of other people. But I don't think I would have been there if it wasn't for being inspired by space.
Yeah. I know I was inspired as a child by Star Trek and by then the Apollo landings, and just getting to experience both from the space shuttle side as well as just launch services with Martin Marietta and Lockheed Martin and now ULA.
There's actually a chapter in my book on the way that science fiction and real space science have been in a continual feedback loop going all the way back to the 1910s. And most people don't realize that I don't think we would have any spaceflight if it wasn't for the early science fiction writers that inspired H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, inspired Goddard and von Braun and everybody else to move forward. And that feedback loop brings you Star Trek, which then inspired a whole new generation of people. I think probably half or 3/4 of the people at NASA might have been inspired by Star Trek. And if you ask Mike Gold, it's probably 100%.
It's funny, these days I get asked Star Trek or Star Wars, and I get to answer The Expanse, and it just messes with people.
I'm with you on that, or For All Mankind. I love that show.
I did want to let everyone know we are accepting questions too. If you have anything you want to be asking Greg. We did mention a little bit ago about the fact that we kind of think of NASA is the anchor tenant. And so I think we're trying to reframe NASA in the role of a consumer of goods and services more than as the purveyor of, which is, the bespoke stuff that you spoke about earlier. We do want to make sure that we're shifting the mindset around the entire ecosystem as we go through that transformation. But do you think there are other benefits or challenges that we need to be thinking about as we go through this transition from bespoke to leveraging services to be able to go do operations as well as missions?
I like to say, if you think of the National Science Foundation, let's say that somebody there decided that we needed to know more about a mole that lived in Patagonia, right? And so they would issue a small grant for that, maybe $50,000 or something, and some researcher would apply, and we would not build a special aircraft to fly that researcher to Argentina, and we wouldn't build a special pompous rover to get over and find the mole. That person would go book a commercial airline flight and rent a car and go out and do their research and then send their receipts in and get reimbursed. And I think we're going to get to that point in the future that you and I are talking about. We're going to do so much more space science for so much less. When you talk about anchor tenancy, though, getting to that point is super critical, and it's important the U.S. do it and not China. But it isn't always about NASA writing a check. It's about NASA using its gravitas to bring investors and bring other international partners to bear on that. So for CLDs, for instance, again, I think there's a lot of other countries that we could bring in that will actually write checks alongside NASA, but we should put a coalition together that makes that happen so the American taxpayer doesn't carry the entire burden. But if we don't do that and we, again, just hand it to China and Russia, I don't think that's a pleasant future for our commercial operators or anyone.
Yeah, I guess I think of it as and though, right? Because there are going to be some missions that you really can't do with today's commercial technology. If I think about the precision pointing that's required to be able to observe the transit of a planet across a sun in a distant system, that's not something that my commercial platforms are capable of controlling to. Just like weapon systems have different requirements, and so you end up with a mixed fleet of logistics aircraft. They're traditional commercial aircraft, but then you've also got some bespoke solutions.
Oh, absolutely. And nobody's going to build a commercial mission to go find out if there's life on Europa or Enceladus.
Yep.
But there's nothing I would like to know more. So I think that's great. And then you look at the international partners. So the UAE sent the HOPE mission to Mars a few years ago, and they didn't have the capability to put that together by themselves. So they had great partners, at American companies like Lockheed Martin, helping them with that, right? And we have that capability, and we should be leveraging that anymore. And the NASA again can be I think a partner in helping make those connections happen.
So I'm not sure if we've already answered this question, but the most voted question right now was, in a 2023 article, you stated cuts at NASA are cuts to America's future economic growth and tax revenues. They would increase future deficits. The writer wholeheartedly agrees, but how do you square that with the president's proposed budget cuts to NASA?
No comment on that. I think it's obvious the position I'm in. I have a book here if you want to buy one about things I've said in the past. But I think the important thing to realize is that any particular news story you see isn't what's really going to happen. You've got a process that involves a Congress and a White House and an Office of Management and Budget and an agency, and we'll find out next year where we really are. But we should always be parsimonious with the taxpayers' money and make sure we get the best value.
Thank you for your no comments. Which foundational infrastructure elements in the cislunar domain require early government investment due to their high cost, technical risk, or uncertain commercial return in order to catalyze a thriving commercial space ecosystem?
Can I actually read that question?
Yeah, take a look. That was so in my opinion.
Yeah, so foundational infrastructure elements in cislunar, I think power is super important. Obviously, position, navigation, and timing. And there are people looking at these things, both from the NASA side and actually from the Space Force side in some cases, as well as from commercial. But you've got to be able to know where you are, and you've got to be able to have power through the lunar night. Probably more important than anything, you've got to be able to communicate. And if we're going to be in a sustainable and permanent presence on the moon, going all the way back to Space Policy Directive 1 in 2017 and restated recently by the White House, then we need to have that infrastructure in place. Then eventually you're going to look at transportation infrastructure. How do you move things from one place to another? How do you get things off of the lunar surface, right? And I think it's important to think about that as we go forward. So nuclear, I think, becomes really an important issue for long-term presence on the moon. Yes, there are peaks of eternal light down at the pole that can be helpful for maybe a mining operation initially down there, but if you really want to survive the lunar night, we need nuclear surface power on the moon. And NASA, I think, is prepared to be a leader in making that happen, and there are commercial operators that have some really interesting applications as well.
Yeah, and I'll make a quick plug. Tomorrow afternoon, there's a cislunar ecosystem workshop as well, if you want to follow up whoever wrote this or anyone else.
Yeah, and I think Bahavia Lal has recently put something out in Space Review, which is a really interesting read on space nuclear.
The other thing I wanted to share was, I think that goes back to some of the differentiation between how the government might approach something and how a commercial endeavor or industry would approach it. I agree nuclear is part of the key, but there's also a lot of work being done on microreactors, so you have just enough power for what you're trying to do. and then you'd cobble together multiple of those to get whatever mission capability you needed. Similarly, part of the conversation we've had with Moon to Mars was around their PNT, and the original concept was have a constellation around the moon, which then means you no longer have radio silence on the far side of the moon where you're trying to do radio astronomy.
That's a challenge too. And actually, I wrote a series of articles in Forbes a couple years ago on lunar orbital congestion, because one of the things most people don't realize is there aren't a lot of good orbits around the moon because of the mass cons. The uneven gravitational environment in the moon makes it a challenge, and you could actually fill up the lower portions of those 4 orbits that are available pretty quickly.
Yeah, that was interesting to understand a little bit more about the physics around the moon too. But in some ways, what NASA's Moon to Mars was doing was focusing on a global solution instead of thinking of it as, how do I operate a factory here where I don't have GPS? What would that do for the moon? And so there's lots of differences of opinions as we move forward into this future state. So it'll be interesting to see how things play together and play out.
And you mentioned that a lot of people don't realize that every factory in the world that's modern, it uses GPS timing to handle its robotics and automation, and our whole industrial process would shut down if we didn't have GPS. And I address that in the first chapter of my book, where I talk about EMP and CMI threats to GPS.
So I'm not sure what the intent of this question is, but what is your view on the balance between NASA supporting industry versus letting companies fail to clear the way for others?
Yeah. So I'll give you a perfect example. This is something I would like to see done: orbital debris mitigation, right? And people have talked about that. There are a couple of companies out there that have some really interesting solutions that might work. There are some people that want a government program to get that junk out of the way. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are other countries that think that maybe government should get that junk out of the way. So the debris that's up there that's problematic was really created by governments. It's important to realize that. It wasn't created by our commercial launch sector. At least the American operators are all very responsible with deorbiting their satellites at the end of life. They're required to by our law. And most of the satellites that are going up count-wise are in very, very low orbits and will come down on their own in a couple years if you didn't do anything. But that junk that's up there belongs to the Chinese, Russian, American, and European governments primarily, and they should get rid of the more dangerous portions of it. How would you do that? So here's my suggestion in a way that addresses this issue: is identify the objects based on their threat, which is a factor of their inclination and their altitude and unique orbital characteristics and the size of the object, and then put a bounty on them, right? Government pays nothing until that object's removed, and when that object's removed, these governments who caused the problem pay for the object to be removed. Then you're not picking the winners and losers, but you are spurring a commercial industry, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't care actually whether it's a Chinese state-owned company or an Israeli tech startup that removes the object, but you're going to bring in investors who are willing to put money in once they see money is available, and the government doesn't have to spend a penny until they get results, as opposed to the idea of the government's going to put an RFP out and pick a particular company and make them the winner in this domain and hope they're right. So we can do that in a lot of different areas, I think. And then with CLDs, the government needs to, I think, build a coalition of partners, public, private, maybe even in some cases agencies outside of NASA and the US government and international, to put enough money into that every year in a guaranteed way that the investors will finally break through and fund those companies that are really ready to go and have some great ideas, but just don't have the ability to close their last round.
So we'll see if you can answer this question. Do you see NASA's mission shifting away from basic science and R&D towards applied technology research and commercialization?
Well, I mean, you have a space technology mission director, right? And to some extent that's its mission. So I don't know that it would be shifting away. And going all the way back to NACA, the original purpose of that agency was to help do wind tunnels and some of the big infrastructure that was needed to make us successful in aviation. So I think that's always been part of what NASA does. I want NASA to continue to be the premier space science agency in the world. I think that human exploration is an amazing thing. We just don't want to do the stuff that commercials perfectly capable of doing. We don't need to repeat that. But if you can help commercial solve problems like nuclear is the perfect example, nuclear propulsion. I mean, that's not something that I really want a startup in Venice, California testing, right? So we've got some amazing sites where we can do that in a public-private partnership with those sort of startups. I was at a nuclear space event actually at Mar-a-Lago earlier this year, and there's a lot of exciting things going on, but that's an area where NASA or some government agency needs to prepare to play a very important role in helping those companies get to where they need to be.
Yeah, I think that goes back to some of the benefit of NASA's culture of safety and helping people understand the risks that they're taking on, whether they understand them initially or not.
And let me just say, though, that I do have sympathy for the concept that NASA may be too risk averse as well.
Sure.
And that it needs to ingest some of that culture from industry. It'd be better to see a little bit more DNA exchange between industry and NASA, and I think that's happening.
Yeah. So I guess another question was, what can NASA do to improve cost performance on projects to avoid those massive overruns?
Right. Again, I don't want to get into any specific budget issues, but I do think that there's a culture that is a little bit slow, a little bit risk averse, and sometimes that risk aversion gets to the point, John, where you actually increase the cost and you increase the risk, because complexity is a risk factor in itself. Simple is better, and there are times when we could learn from industry about how to do things in a way that could be a lot more efficient, and that's a cultural issue that needs to be addressed within the agency. And I think, frankly, everybody's a little bit aware of that. Of course, there's some people that think everything's perfect and are going to always be in denial, but I do think that there's a real opportunity to find efficiencies and remove the fat with liposuction as opposed to cutting off a leg in order to reduce the mass of something.
You know, I sometimes wonder if part of it is the DNA of the ecosystem as it has existed, where in order to get your mission sold, you had to sell your mission, as opposed to trying to put together the best price and get the best bang for the buck. And that it's just a cultural difference in the way we've done the ecosystem in the past, and where I think we see ourselves going in the future.
And that's why I mentioned James Webb and Mars Sample Return and some of these other big science missions, for instance, and same thing on human exploration. You get that budget wedge in there. And every CFO that I've talked to, and I've made a point of talking to basically all the ones that are still alive, you know, will warn you about that problem of people will come in and lowball the project because they know that once Congress has a sunk cost in their teeth, they won't let go of it. And what they miss is that opportunity, because we don't know what science we didn't get to do when we allowed the Space Telescope to go an order of magnitude over budget. And I'm not criticizing anybody or vendor in the process, but there was a lot of science that didn't happen because that money had to be spent on that project, right? Mm-hmm. Which is amazing and successful, and thank God it unfolded and all that. But we could do much better if we were honest with ourselves from the beginning, and we've got to get to the point where we simply don't accept those sort of occurrences.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree on that. You had mentioned earlier the importance of engaging new international partners. Is this a NASA job or a domain where commercial leads?
I think NASA's been amazing, right? If you look at the only area that, for instance, the Russians and the Americans have been able to work together for more than a decade, it's really been space, and that's not always been comfortable recently for obvious reasons. And,
right.
You know, I know for many people that's been very, very personal. But NASA has been amazing at that. Everywhere I go in the world, and I travel a lot, I will see a kid with NASA shirts on, right? I've never seen a kid with a Homeland Security shirt or an IRS shirt, right? Or what, Department of Education. No, NASA shirt, right? Go on public transportation from London to Seoul, and you will see that. So NASA does a great job of that. We should be completely aware of it and continue to do that. And in Florida, where I live, I mean, there's so many people come out to see the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex that Delaware North runs out there, and you hear so many languages being spoken, and they're taking their kids to see that. Look at this great thing America's doing. that's a value that we should not surrender.
I agree. In a lot of ways, I think commercial is hamstrung in some of that, in part because of ITAR with dual use, but I think also the focus is different, right? Where part of NASA's charter is to inspire. And I think that's something that NASA really brings to the
You know, let me be fair to commercial. I have to say, there's a lot of people that come to me as an educator that want to enter the space industry because they're excited about what commercial space is doing. And sometimes that's things that Elon has done, sometimes it's things Jeff Bezos has done, sometimes it's things that Tory Bruno's done. And they've all done a good job of getting out, I think, and making space exciting again in a way that it wasn't as exciting when we knew how to do everything 15 years ago. This is how it's going to work. There's nothing new to learn. We have a process and a procedure for everything, and we're just going to execute these missions that get handed to us. And we're in an exciting new world now.
Full disclosure, 15 years ago, we still didn't know how to do everything. We just
thought we did.
Well, and we had figured out how to make this work. Doesn't mean that we actually knew why it worked. It just knew this formula worked, and if you changed anything, we didn't know what would happen. Yeah. And we've learned that through lots of different learning opportunities.
I think I left out Peter Beck and Richard Branson. They deserve some credit too. That really inspirational leaders.
Should NASA continue to support higher education, or can we rely on the private sector to fill the growing funding gaps?
Yeah, I don't want to comment on any specific budgetary issues. Again, that's not for me to do, but I do think that NASA's been an inspirational entity. Like I said, it inspired my own movement into STEM. As far as funding it, I don't know that's NASA's role as an exploration agency, but that's something that Congress and the White House will have to decide what they want to do there. What they do well, though, is partner with universities like mine to do amazing science and employ graduate researchers to move America forward. And I think it's exciting when students, particularly graduate students, are actually working on projects that fly in space. And with commercial space, we're seeing ever more of that. When you look at that launch cost chart, we're getting to the point where, frankly, a club at a university could get together and have a car wash and some bake sales and build a small satellite out of components that you can get off the point and put them on a ride share or a mobile upper stage platform that can move and do science with thousands of dollars. That's an amazing place to be. And NASA can, I think, help facilitate there.
Yeah, I guess I still see a role in the future for the innovation engine that is academia, coming up with new ways to answer questions and partnering with NASA to help make those things a reality. But to your point, that's not direct funding of an academic institution, right?
Yeah, I think Jared Isaacman commented at a recent speech about how he'd like to see university-led space programs as opposed to just reacting to NASA RFPs and being part of something else. And I think, again, with where we're going here, we're going to be able to see more of that. It's a different model. They'll need to get external funding partners who are willing to step up and fund that. But that could happen, and NASA should be a partner, not an owner or an obstacle to that.
All right. Since we're almost out of time, I wanted to throw you a curveball. A few years ago, I was standing around at an LSIC event, Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium, and it was a bunch of NASA seniors of our age, but it was also one of their high-pot YP, young professionals. And they were espousing what the future was for NASA and asking each of those people, what they thought for the future would be like when she was our age. And they came around to me and I said, well, it's aviation in NASA is the future of space in a generation or two. So I was curious what you think of that response or where you think NASA's focus would be in a couple generations.
Well, I don't know that it needs to have a focus. I just want it to have an efficiency and a success that delivers on whatever challenges we face as a nation in both aviation and and its space. And I think that given the legacy, the heritage, and the great people that are there, I hope to see that. I hope to be confirmed and find myself at NASA headquarters as the CFO. If I do, that's really my last job. I have no aspiration beyond that other than returning to my plow at UCF and making way for new and younger people, because I'd like to see a lot more new faces there, and there's so much excitement. I've had a couple high school students come up to me today already at our booth and talk to me about that, so super excited about that.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Autry, for your time today.
Thanks, Sean. Really appreciate it.